What I normally do is just say, welcome to the show. Give us a brief biography of yourself. That's my kind of. I always open with that. So, a brief biography, if you have one available, would be good.
Well, I was born in South London some time ago, as you can probably tell from my accent.
Yeah.
We don't have these old London accents anymore. And I never really liked working, so I tried getting into the started off with music, playing in bands, and then got a bit more into the art racket and writing. So I have had some success at that. Some nice grants. The most generous grant I ever received was a Hamlin Award for £50,000 to sustain my art career. That was very nice.
Yeah, nice.
Meant I didn't have to worry about any extra jobs to keep myself afloat for a couple of years. Fantastic award. It's the one all British visual artists want to win. Although it's not as visible as the Turner Prize, it's worth a lot more money. I mean, it's more now than when I got it, because I'm talking about 12 years ago. But just carry on with that kind of stuff. I think I mainly write fiction, but I write some non-fiction books. So my first book in the late 80s was about the kind of post-war avant-garde letters situationist fluxus. That's all pretty well covered now, but at the time it wasn't so well covered. My last non-fiction book was called Re-Enter the Dragon, was about the subgenre of Bruceploitation films, martial arts subgenre which riff on Bruce Lee, sometimes with clones and imitators and sometimes in other ways. With his brother carrying on a story from a film or whatever, or an investigation into Bruce Lee's death, which in the case of the death of Bruce Lee, from the mid-70s, concludes that he died of oversex, which was a rumour in Hong Kong at the time. I have an interest in martial arts as well. So the most recent book is called Fascist Yoga, Grifters, Occultists, White Supremacists, and the New Order in Wellness, because as a novelist, I found a lot of writers presented their work quite tedious. So I had this idea that I would, I started off doing other things. I recited my work from memory as a kind of memory act, and I did ventriloquism, which Ken Campbell, if people know who he is, they may not, he's quite well known, kind of live artist and also ventriloquist. He saw me talking one time and told me that I had to become a ventriloquist. I was born for it. I had a stone face and I hardly opened my mouth when I talked. So all great skills for a ventriloquist. He wanted to teach me. I didn't have time at the time, but I taught myself later. It's a matter of practicing, which I don't do now. But 10, 15 minutes a day, and I am a pretty good practice every day. I am a pretty good ventriloquist, but I haven't been doing it lately. Then I got the idea to stand on my head. And as I went to a boxing class at my local gym and lifted weights there as well, before a yoga class, I figured out they did headstands in the yoga class. So I went to the yoga class where, when you stayed in from the boxing class that was in there before, didn't make you very popular with a lot of the students. So I had a nicely unpleasant experience of yoga from the get-go. Of people who didn't want me in the class, although the teacher, who was from Vegas, insisted that it was okay because if I was doing boxing before, I was getting out all my aggression, and I was in a perfect state to do yoga. And that was how I got into doing a little bit of yoga, which I don't do now. So is that enough? Brief biography is too long. I once did a talk at Artist Television Access in San Francisco back in the 90s. I think I was scheduled for a 45-minute talk, but they had no one else that night, so I talked for 3.5 hours. There you go. But I'll let you ask a question.
Yeah. A little fun fact, you probably already know this, but Ken Campbell was originally going to be, he was considered for the 7th Doctor in Doctor Who, and one of his kind of colleagues, I suppose, or peers got the job instead, Sylvester McCoy, and they used to perform together.
No, he was a great guy, and really, I'd never met him before. He just saw me at this event speaking and came over and was insistent that I had this natural talent that I probably didn't realise I have. And he was completely correct. Amazing guy, really good artist as well.
Yeah, I mean, our show's named after a Robert Anton Wilson book, and he did a whole run of the Illuminatus trilogy. I think it was, he did like a sort of play version of it, didn't he? And so he's definitely
Yeah, he involved Bill Drummond, I believe, in that play.
Yeah,
He
he did.
became
Yeah,
a
yeah. And his daughter, I think Daisy Campbell, I think that's her name. She, I believe, does a Robert Anton Wilson play now as well. I've not seen it,
yeah.
but yeah, yeah, no, interesting crowd to be a part of, definitely. So in your book subtitled "Grifters, Occultists, White Supremacists, and the New Order in Wellness," do you sort of see those categories as a continuum, or as like a sort of separate traditions rather that keep kind of crossing paths? Would you
No,
say?
I think they're very hard to separate out often, and especially separating out fascism from grifters is very difficult.
Mhm.
From kind of Mussolini, via all sorts of other unsavory figures in the middle of the 20th century, which we won't necessarily name, um, through to Trump. And obviously people say, oh, want to argue about whether Trump's a fascist. It doesn't really bother me whether you call a lot of contemporary figures fascists or not. You'd still want to oppose their politics. But yeah, I do see them as very much connected. And, there's. I was thinking about that this earlier today, about kind of the occult and kind of grifting with a lot of those new age beliefs. In the book, I mention a few exercises. There's a French guy whose books were translated by Ryder, who readers interested in the occult will know, we're a big occult publisher in the UK. And in the 30s, they did a couple of books by this guy. And he had this exercise, which I mentioned in the book, where you have your arm bent and you have to convince yourself that your arm is straight. And what you're going to get out of doing that, I don't know. I mean, I've tried it, and all sorts of other exercises that are supposed to develop your psychic powers. But what I can compare it to is actually doing ventriloquism, because when you first learn, you have to convince yourself that the dummy is alive, and when you actually manage to do that, to be a convincing ventriloquist, it's quite a surreal moment. So I can see on one level why that might appear like a useful technique to do, but not in terms of developing psychic powers, because I just don't believe in ESP or anything else
Mm.
like that. So yeah, I think they're all very connected, and the white supremacism ties back through a lot of the early yoga figures in the Western world. I mean, one of the things we have to get into is differentiating, you know, ancient meditation practices from the Indian continent or subcontinent, which we could have an argument about what term to use in relationship to it. And what's practiced in gyms and yoga studios today. And there's a whole body of writing which is referenced in the footnotes of the book, academic writing about how yoga was invented in the earlier part of the 20th century. Is generally seen to be in the 1920s by Indian nationalists who adapted European kind of gym exercises and married them with Hindu ideas, and claimed that the European exercises were inferior versions of ancient Hindu practice. But what I found interesting was when I started looking at stuff is that if you go back, there's this figure, Pierre Bernard, also known as Great Om, who was doing this same admixture of materials as the Indian nationalist yogi gurus of the 20s, who a whole group of academics see as inventing modern yoga. But Bernard was doing it in the USA, 10, 15, maybe 20 years before. And when you look through at his followers, he didn't write that much, although there are some Aryanist elements in his International Tantric Journal that he published one issue of, but it was numbered number 5. We're not 100% sure of the date, but it's around 1906. But when you follow through his followers like Hamish McLaren, who wrote Eastern Philosophy for Western Minds, which was endorsed by Bernard and has an introduction from another of Bernard's disciples, Francis Yeats-Brown, what you find is that McLaren is very much in favor of yoga because he claims it was invented by the blonde Aryan invaders of the Indus Valley, which is the valley that separates India and Pakistan 5,000 years ago, and that it is a kind of Aryan moral code and creed. And he contrasts this to Christianity, which he doesn't like at all. He's explicitly anti Semitic in this book. So he sees Christianity is a Semitic moral system that is unsuitable for Aryans, which is why everyone should practice yoga. And Yeats-Brown, who wrote the introduction to that book, was another key Bernard disciple, and he was also a notorious fascist and friend of Hitler, Mussolini, Franco. When he met Hitler, Hitler told him how the film based on his completely fake autobiography, but which bears very little relationship to it, starring Gary Cooper, Lives of the Bengal Lancer, was his favourite film, apparently, which I quote from his cousin who wrote his biography in the book on that. And Bernard, obviously being a fascist, was also into these Aryan theories of the origins of yoga. But if you actually, he also claimed to have learned yoga in India, as did other fascist yogis, JFC Fuller being another key one, who was a disciple of Crowley, who in some ways was the first to teach yoga in the UK, or could be argued as the first to teach it in the UK. Certainly one of the earliest, easily identifiable yogi teachers in the UK. But obviously, coming out of that occult tradition, there was a lot less interest in the local elements. There was a search for a universal truth, and so Crowley, of course, wanted to throw away 95% of what you found in Patanjali or whatever in the Yoga Sutras, and provide the remaining 5% as pure occult gold. So yeah, there's a endless connection between all those threads. And it is, in some ways I was more interested in dealing with the postural practice. I didn't really want to get into traditional Hindu techniques for meditation, or not just Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, and earlier kind of animist or whatever religions. But it's very difficult to avoid the occult influences within yoga. And certainly, Bernard is a really important figure in terms of his disciples in spreading yoga in the earlier part of the 20th century. So I've mentioned McLaren, but Yeats-Brown is far more important because he did a book called Yoga Explained. But before that, he was featured in a whole lot of magazine articles, and so he was spreading yoga, or Bernard's invented yoga, however you want to look at it, because it's a different tradition from what you find on the Indian subcontinent in the 30s, quite effectively through magazines. And then Bernard also had a nephew called Theos Bernard, who made all sorts of newspaper headlines to do with his yoga and his alleged travels in Tibet, although there's a lot of fakery in his books, which academic researchers have drawn out now. Theos Bernard. So there were a lot of magazine articles about Theos Bernard, so a little bit after Yeats-Brown. So both of these figures, who were disciples of Bernard, essentially were key in spreading the idea of what we can call modern postural practice. And then there was also a guy called Paul Jukes, who was a British spy and musician, who was also a follower of Bernard, who did what are believed to be the first yoga TV programs for the BBC at the end of the 40s. So you can see from all that, I mean, although obviously not so many people had TV when the first yoga programs were broadcast, all these figures who were direct disciples of Bernard. I mean, Theos Bernard claims to have learned initially from an Indian guru, but it looks like he probably learned from his father, and then he went and stayed with his uncle. And his system definitely looks very much like Francis Yeats-Brown and Jukes' system. So you can see they're all coming from the same place and having this particular practice. And there's an interesting difference between the kind of vinyasa flows that people tend to like a lot now. Although you can, of course, go and do yin yoga, you can do goat yoga or puppy yoga, both of which are pretty cruel to the animals. So why anyone caring would want to do those things, I don't know. I certainly wouldn't want to exploit animals in that way. And the puppies are basically forced to perform. There's quite a lot of animal charity material about how horrendous puppy yoga is. And it's not a joke. I don't know why anyone would do it. But yeah, but now you have the kind of flow type yoga that a lot of people like, different flows, and you can go to mandala yoga where you turn around on your sun salutations, which again aren't really a feature of yoga in the first part of the 20th century, postural yoga. Back then it was much more a series of static poses. And it's also interesting, you see the difference in the kind of things that people do. So you see, as a meditation pose, I mean, Yeats-Brown in his book Yoga Explained from 37 describes headstand lotus, which is where you're in a headstand but your legs are in a lotus position, as a meditation pose. That's not something I've ever come across in a yoga class, but in the interest of research, when I was writing the book, I did try the posture. And Pierre Bernard, actually, in one of his books, describes an exercise where you raise and lower the crossed legs as essentially a core exercise. And I tried it; it's pretty difficult. It's a good core workout. So not necessarily everything is fake within yoga in terms of a practice, in terms of exercise, but certainly, there's a huge academic discourse about how a lot of what is practiced as modern postural practice or modern Western yoga is essentially European gymnastics and doesn't originate in India.
Yeah, it's a bit
But
like
yeah, I
tantra,
tried
isn't
it.
it?
Yeah, I
Tantra's
tried it.
similar.
Yeah.
It's like the way tantra has been kind of sort of it seems to be even more popular now than it was back in the sort of 60s and 70s. You see these videos popping up online everywhere now of this kind of version of tantra where there's some really quite funny videos of people just making noises over women and sort of going literally like this, and then the women having these convulsions, and you just think, I've read a fair bit about tantra. It's something I've been looking at, trying to read about the origins of tantra at least. I don't remember reading anything like that in there. It just seems to be co-opted a lot of the time, and it seems that that's always happened with things like tantra and yoga. You have people like Blavatsky sort of almost like filtering the original, and then I don't know what they've done to it. They sort of filter out what they saw at the time as undesirable, or as you say, un-Aryan in the book, and it's this fascinating sort of it's this fascinating thing that's finally starting to come into the light, as it were, now that people are actually starting to realize, oh, hang on, there's this horrible kind of right wing, almost like sort of nasty like fascist kind of origin to all of this stuff. It's a little bit, well, to the Western version of this stuff, I should say. So that's kind of, it's interesting, and that's finally coming into the light a lot more now. And but why do you think academia in the past is always sort of, it's kind of almost whitewashed people like Bernard, hasn't it? It's in a way they sort of gloss over everything you say in the book at one point where they're talking about Bernard, that they say about, they sort of put him in quote marks, his racism, and they say, oh, well, he's it's almost like they don't believe that he's racist in the way they transmit him. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
I mean, obviously it's a lot clearer with his followers, because there's writing by his followers, it's more clearly by them. I mean, he published and appears to have edited the International Journal of the Tantric Order, although the International Tantric Order didn't appear to exist outside America.
Hmm.
And one of the earlier academic writers on him basically talks about that publication, a guy called Hugh Urban, as a kind of typical Finda-Sakal mishmash of Western interpretations of Tantra with, Western sex magic and all these other elements. It's not the production of someone who's trained in an authentic Tantra. And obviously, what a lot of the Western kind of reports of Tantra and writings on Tantra do is kind of unify a lot of very diffuse traditions and then misinterpret them by trying to kind of create a single tradition out of things that differed in different places and at different
Hmm.
times. Um, but yeah, Urban is, I think, a good in his essay on Bernard. Is a good and believable source, and he basically says that Bernard faked a lot of his biography. We can't really tell when he was born. We don't know that for sure. We don't know for sure what his original name was, etc., etc., and basically points out that the publication we do know he was responsible for as the publisher is not authentic Tantra, but a kind of Western mishmash with a lot of sex magic. Um, but what then happened was a Rolling Stone journalist called Robert Love decided that he wanted to write about Bernard, and basically virtually every academic source that you look at, and I kind of point quite a few of these out in the books, as well as some non-academic sources, not just about Pierre Bernard, but also about Theus Bernard, the nephew. They refer you back to Love, and sometimes Love refers you back to the academics who, in their books, refer you to him. So you have these kind of circular citations. But I think it does show how one person kind of coming into a subject and pushing a particular point of view very hard, where it's peripheral to a lot of the other people writing about it, they'll just accept his expertise. But then when you look at, for example, his proof of Bernard's real name and date of birth, his proof is that a relative of Bernard's told him that they'd seen this in a family Bible. It was written in seen it written in a family Bible. That's just hearsay. That's not
Mm.
proof.
No.
And again, he wants to prove that Bernard had this genuine tantric guru, Hamyati. But again, there isn't really any proof, and all the proof that is cited all comes from Bernard, essentially, although Robert Love does fudge a reference to the International Tantric Journal. He lists it by its initials, doesn't tell you what it is, but I was able to figure out what it was, and cites an interview in a publication which Bernard was responsible for as the publisher, possibly the editor, and possibly the writer of the article within it, that shows that Hamyati has an authentic guru tradition. So I think if someone is very keen to kind of forge a story in a particular way and push that forward, and then academics just need a little bit of peripheral information about that, they haven't bothered to check through what he's saying and find out that what he's pushing is wrong. So yeah, we're down to one guy really heavily pushing a narrative that appealed to him, and I think he thought would appeal to people who might want to read his book, and the narrative isn't true, and that's why we have all these problems. And if you go back to Urban, who was writing independently, you have a much more realistic picture of the difficulties of pinning stuff down about Bernard.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. The thing that really struck me um, was this kind of thread of Aryanism or Aryan belief, I suppose you'd say, that seems to kind of just keeps popping up, doesn't it, throughout your
Yeah,
story, and this kind of connection to. There's even a group called Yoga, isn't there? That to do with the Fume kind of
yeah.
takeover, and it is interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the Aryan? There's this belief, isn't there, that the Aryan that yoga is a more kind of Aryan kind of practice than it is, and it was sort of held by the brown-skinned Indians, who were sort of. Could you talk about that kind of section? I love that. I found that really fascinating. That part of the book.
Oh,
The kind of.
again, that's
Mm,
going back to McLaren, who I was talking
mm,
about. McLaren, who I was talking about earlier, and also you find it in Yeats-Brown. So they
mm,
describe skin color in very racialized terms and are very obnoxious about people with a less than white skin who aren't
mm,
blue-eyed and haired like Aryans. So I did kind of explain a little bit of that, and we could maybe go into, well, you're using the Italian name for Rijeka, which is a
mm,
port city now in Croatia. And after the First World War, that was who should control it was disputed. So you had D'Annunzio, the Italian poet, who thought he'd take it over, and basically formed a kind of proto-fascist state in Rijeka. It's politicized to use one term or the other, so I prefer to call it Rijeka, the Croatian name, just as I have quite a lot of Irish heritage from my mother. So the family's from Cork, so I like to refer to Derry in the north of Ireland as Derry, and it's very clearly in the north of Ireland and not in some other place that British imperialists might call the north of Ireland.
mm,
So I like to use the term, the name, the Croatian name for the city, Rijeka. but most Western academics do use the Italian. It's you writing in English. So D'Annunzio, kind of invented the balcony speeches and the Roman salutes and introduced all the ritual of fascism and the kind of secularized religious rites around martyrs to the cause. So he created the first fascist state. One of his key lieutenants was a guy called Guido Keller, and he, with another guy called Giovanni Cosimo and some people connected to the Futurists, formed a group called Yoga. So initially they were running a column in the Futurist newspaper that was published in Rijeka during the occupation, which was 1919, 1920. And at the end of 1920, they were published 4 issues of their own paper. Cosimo, in particular, who went on to have a literary career in Italy, wrote some pretty unpleasant things, again, talking about how the Italians had been kind of held back by the negative races, citing the French, the British, and particularly the Jews as the races who were the cause of Italians not being as great as he believed they should be. So it was a kind of Latino imperialism with a racism directed very much against the local Slavic population, and the entire population suffered terribly under this regime, which ended after there was a treaty, and what was to happen to the city was agreed. So the Italian Navy got D'Annunzio and his fascist cronies out by firing from warships into the town. So that was the end of the regime at that time. I mean, also Mussolini, his support for that regime built up his profile. But that, obviously, this is a Latino fascism, not a strictly Aryan one. But again, if you want to kind of go through a little bit of some of the other history, you're then getting into kind of Nazis, and there's a lot of nonsense talked and written about the Nazis and the occult. A lot of things that
Mm.
aren't true
Mm.
written about them. But Himmler, influenced by a guy called Hauer, an Indiologist, was very into a lot of that kind of yogic Indian practice. And is said to have carried about, Hindu holy books with him, and to have, you know, interpreted his reactions to the Holocaust and his duty to kind of watch executions in terms of in those religious terms. Um, and I was trying to think back to some of the other Aryan elements that you could see feeding through from that. So yeah, if you then want to go into the post-war period, having noted that, and you find esoteric Hitlerism, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Mhm.
If the listeners aren't, this stems from a woman who used the name Savitri Devi, although it wasn't her original name, who was a mixture of English, Greek, French, and whatever, but European, but got fascinated by false myths about Greek Aryanism, and ended up going to India to kind of pursue those interests. So she mixed very much in Hindu circles, and acted as a kind of collaborator between kind of the Germans and the Japanese, conveying messages and stuff during the war. And after the defeat of the Axis powers, she wanted to refound National Socialism as a religion. So she kind of wrote a book, which she self-published, called Lightning in the Sun, which saw Hitler, in her words, as he who returned whenever he was needed. So he was the late-born child of light who'd previously incarnated as Akhenaten and Genghis Khan, and Hitler was the 10th incarnation of Vishnu as Kalki, according to Savitri Devi. So he was a kind of supernatural being. And again, you can see that as paralleling a lot of QAnon theory, where Trump is posited as this supernatural being kind of trying to save the world from a cabal of cannibalistic paedophiles. I mean, it's complete nonsense, but it's the same kind of thing. And again, in a more Latino context, that esoteric Hitlerism was taken up by Miguel Serrano, not that long after David started with it, who was a Chilean diplomat. And he wrote his three enormously long, turgid tomes on esoteric Hitlerism. So, it's it ends up being typically hybrid like anything else. So modern pastoral practice is very hybrid. Esoteric Hitlerism is also a kind of completely culturally hybrid, and it has those contradictions that you find in all traditionalist movements, which is that traditional societies weren't traditionalists. They couldn't possibly have had a traditional ideology because traditionalism emerges as a reaction to modernism, and without modernism, you can't have traditionalism.
Mm.
And it's very much a product of modernism. That's its huge internal contradiction, and its hybridity also emerges from that. So we could, again, loop back to some figures like Julius Evola in terms of Tantra, whose yoga of
Guénon
power.
maybe as well. René
Sorry?
Guénon. And there's
Oh,
René
yeah,
Guénon. Yeah, I mean
yeah, yeah.
that
I mean,
traditionalist
he's less,
movement. They were very
less
keen on Hindu. Oh, sorry, I'll let you.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, he's not. I wouldn't call Green on a fascist myself,
No.
although I can understand why people might. But I don't. I think his traditionalism is slightly different, and obviously he went a Muslim route, whereas
Mm.
Evola went a pagan route. Um, but yeah, maybe you do have some things to throw in there. I ought to let you say something. It's supposed to be a presentation.
It's all good. No, I was just thinking that it's interesting that so many of these kind of Aryan obsessed kind of fascist yoga types seem to have a similar view to traditionalism in the sense that it's almost like this perennial view where they see yoga as a kind of they see kind of Christianity and the modern kind of Judeo-Christian groups as kind of stained somewhat, and that these kind of Aryan groups are the way to go. Whereas the traditionalists, like Guénon, the reason I brought him up was he was sort of obsessed with sort of going back to a source, wasn't he? Like an origin, and obviously the Nazis or the fascists saw yoga as one of these kind of, or at least that kind of era of practice as a kind of Aryan traditional source kind of material again. It's interesting that how these things sort of overlap a little bit. But yeah, I mean that was just more of an observation than anything. But one thing I was interested in was the with the yoga group. Do you see them as kind of like almost like proto counterculture, or as maybe
Yeah,
just
I
as
mean, I think that,
yeah.
precisely, you do have a fascist counterculture, and they are, the first fascist counterculture, as far as I can see. I
Mm,
mean, obviously, people argue about when fascism, the origins of fascism. I mean, I quite like Steve Sternhill, although he's fairly controversial in fascist studies, and he ties fascism very explicitly, has it emerging in France in 1913 in books like The Birth of Fascist Ideology. Um, Regardless of whether Sternhill is correct or not, fascism didn't emerge that much earlier. So, 1920 for the yoga group in Rijeka, that's, probably the first fascist counterculture, when the, fascist ideology is just being kind of hammered out. And again, that, you're talking about that tradition, that desire for perennial tradition, and that kind of wanting to look back and see something as a 5,000-year old tradition rather than a kind of modern invention, which it is in the case of modern postural practice. That's very much a conservative view. I mean, the futurists who, the yoga group were allied with, but not in line with, were more unusual. But if you look at Umberto Eco's fascism, he argues that fascist groups can have a whole lot of different positions. So you can have one fascist group that has some positions in common with other fascist groups, and then some fascist groups that have no positions in common. He provides a list of elements of fascist thinking, but kind of being backward looking is definitely, and wanting a kind of a great tradition is part of a fascist movement. And so, the yoga group did shift from away from that futurist interest in the future and technology, um, back to a kind of backward-looking pastoralism and embracing the kind of corporatism, which was never actually implemented in Rijeka during the occupation, but was written and talked about. So they do have that backward-looking element.
Mm. So before we talk about kind of like daytime TV and televangelists and the like, we should really. I mean, we covered the occult a lot on this show, and obviously Crowley comes up a lot. So one of the kind of key figures in the book that you talk about is one of Crowley's students, J.C. Fuller.
Yeah.
And we've never actually done a show on Fuller purely because I sort of just don't like him very much. So this is a good opportunity to, maybe ratchet him into a show finally. And so, yeah, could you talk about Fuller and why? I mean, his take on yoga was obviously a little bit more occult centric, I suppose, or Western esoteric centric than the others. Could you talk? How did you come across Fuller and his take on things?
Uh, I've been aware of Fuller for a very long time. I mean, I probably, I used to hang around the West End and go in these shops like Dark They Were and Golden Eyed.
Hmm.
So I started going down the West End with my mates when I was 12, when this will give my age away, which was with no adult supervision. This was in 1974. Um, so I was going to places like the science fiction bookshop, Dark They Were and Golden Eyed. And I certainly, by the time I was into punk, I noticed some Aleister Crowley books in there. So I think I got a copy of either Moonchild or Diary of a Drug Fiend first. So I read the fiction was the first things I read by Crowley, probably when I was 15 or 16, and I thought they were absolutely hilarious. I mean, I'd already been reading figures like T. Lobsang Rampa when I was much younger. You know, The Third Eye. I thought it was absolutely ridiculous. I couldn't believe that anyone would actually believe the crap he was writing, but it was very funny to me. So from Crowley, I would have at some point got to Fuller inevitably because he was quite a key figure in Crowley's circle
Mm.
for the brief time he was in it before he decided that Crowley didn't defend himself enough from accusations stemming from his sex magic with men. So to be honest, I can't tell you when I first came across Fuller, but one of the obviously he takes up a lot of the occultist discourse from Crowley, and it's quite often when you read Fuller's yoga book, it's obviously still very heavily indebted to Crowley's take on yoga, but he does like to Fuller again, although he clearly learned his yoga from Crowley, and historians like Kate Imey have done the archival research and written papers on how he learned his yoga from Crowley. But he, again, like Yeats-Brown, who learned his yoga from Pierre Bernard, and there's all sorts of ways we can prove that. It's in the book, so I won't. Imey also deals with that in her essay, which is about Yeats-Brown and Fuller. She's been through the letters and everything else in the archives of Fuller material. But he again claimed he'd learned his yoga in India and likes to extol, he'll quote a Western occultist and then extol the greater exactness of a Indian figure on the same subject. But he's, very clearly a Western esotericist, and his yoga is very much in that occult and meditation groove rather than the postural yoga. But what you find is the two things feeding back and forth. I suppose the other thing that why Fuller is interesting is that he was a military theorist, as well as a top member of the British Union of Fascists, and he was very interested in militarized warfare. So he essentially invented the idea of the Blitzkrieg, which the Nazis took up. And allegedly, he was invited to the first kind of Nazi military parade and to Hitler's 50th birthday. Obviously, very sympathetic to Hitler's politics because they essentially shared the same views. Although Fuller was not a Nazi because he was a member of the British Union of Fascists, and it's important to remember that while all Nazis are fascists, not all fascists are Nazis. There are all kinds of versions of fascist ideology. We talked a little bit about the kind of Latino strands versus the Aryan strands. But a Nazi is quintessentially a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP to give it its German initials. But yeah, Hitler allegedly said while watching a mechanized military parade with Fuller, "How do you like your children?" And Fuller replied, "They've grown so much, I don't know that I recognize them." So, there's that other aspect to him, but he basically seems to be a very unpleasant personality, so I can understand why you haven't really wanted to deal with it. And Crowley is much more amusing, and obviously, while some people have accused Crowley of having fascist tendencies, and I can understand why they do that, Crowley was not a political fascist.
No, and he did sort of later in life. I found it quite interesting. Although he was particularly racist earlier on in his life, he sort of did seem to try and correct that somewhat a little bit later, which is kind of unusual for someone of his time and his background, I suppose. But yeah, I can also see why people would kind of find that in Crowley as well. Sometimes that some of the stuff he's said, well, written, I should say,
Yeah,
definitely seems to back that up. So, how did yoga move from kind of fascist mysticism to daytime TV without losing the racial baggage? I've always found that kind of interesting from the book as well. We've got like Hittelman and Frank Rudolph and people like that. Could we talk a
yeah,
little bit about that kind of move, post-war move?
yeah. I mean, I think the thing is, obviously, after the defeat of the Axis powers, unless you were Savitri Devi or Miguel Serrano, you didn't really want to. Or Ezra Pound for that matter, you didn't want to kind of embrace fascism. So in some ways, figures like Yeats-Brown got left behind, but in other ways, their kind of influence lived on. So if you look at a popular writer like Harvey Day, what I did for some of the research was just looking to see what books on yoga had been published at different times and what was accessible. So while there are books from the same kind of time periods by Indian, you know, postural practice practitioners. Uh, if you wanted those, you would have to write away to an address in India and pay for them. And what was much more generally circulating in the West were books by Caucasians or Western writers on yoga. So we've talked a little bit about Yeats-Brown and McLaren for kind of or even Fuller for information on yoga in its different forms, not just modern postural practice in the pre-war period. I mean, their books were reprinted after the war, particularly in India. You see a lot of those kind of books being reprinted, but even Yeats-Brown's books were reprinted in Italy in places in translation. His book on yoga. But you move on to a new kind of set of writers and people putting stuff out. So there were a couple of books published in the UK in '51 on yoga, one by Harvey Day and one by someone calling themselves Desmond Dunn. And if you look at Day, I mean, he's clearly anti-Nazi and proud to have been in the British forces. He's also, explicitly anti-racist in places in his books. But at the same time, in his books on yoga, he also wrote on a lot of other occult subjects and on health and wellness. But his first book on yoga about yoga came out in '51, and then there's a book called The Study and Practice of Yoga from a couple of years later. And he, if you look at the bibliographies and who he's citing, he's talking about Yeats-Brown, Pierre Bernard, all these figures from the Bernard Circle. So you can see the kind of influence kind of moving on through the latter half of the 20th century, but with people with quite different positions. And he's also, explicitly talks about the Aryan origins of yoga 5,000 years ago in the Indus Valley. So, despite in some ways some quite shockingly different politics, he's still prepared to carry on with that kind of line of misinformation, I guess you'd call it. So you see this kind of flow going down because he's looking around for what he can get hold of, what information's about. He's very much a hack. And again, if you go to Desmond Dunn, he's pulling on the same, less explicitly, but pulling in the same areas, and also pulling on a lot of the occult discourse. His real name was James Lee Richardson, and as James Lee, he also edited Prediction, which is a magazine probably some people will know, that went for a very, very long time. But when you go, he edited it from when it started in the 30s through till 53, when he started his own publishing business. Um, and he sold mail order occult courses from the late 40s onwards, and also mail order yoga courses from the late 40s on. So a lot, they were just pulling out from the pre-war period a lot of information or misinformation, and pushing it on. And then when you look on through other figures like Indria Devi, who shouldn't be mixed up with Savitri Devi, um, who, again, she's adopted an Indian name. She was a mix of Russian and Swedish parentage, but had got interested in yoga through Yoga Yamasharaka, and whose real name was William. Oh God, Aikins. Sorry, I'm not. My brain's disengaged right now. I don't know if you can hear, but there's helicopters just going over and over my flat. So,
Yeah, yeah. I was
which I
wondering
hope
what that was.
doesn't ruin this
No,
recording.
that's fine.
William Aiken Walker. And so her initial influences were from a Westerner New Thought proponent who was also posing with an Indian name to write his yoga books at the beginning of the 20th century. And then through theosophy, she kind of made more connections to yoga, and eventually ended up with an Indian yoga teacher when she'd moved to India. And she went to China with her husband, and then after he died, she ended up in the US and kind of running yoga courses for Hollywood stars. So as a kind of personal trainer to celebrity, she had a kind of reflected celebrity in the 50s, and had books on yoga published. And again, she, in those books, which appear to be ghostwritten, but figures like Fuller are quoted because basically their work was readily available in what we can call the overdeveloped world. And so writers on yoga would draw on them. I mean, things start changing more once you get to the 60s and into the 70s with the counterculture and that kind of association between hippies and Indian gurus. But again, the counterculture is often misread, and I'd see it more as libertarian than left wing. I mean, there were some left wing elements in the 60s counterculture, but it was much more libertarian and kind of
Mhm.
ties in more with the kind of Elon Musk, J.D. Vance kind of view of the world, I think, than a kind of Marxist or whatever leftist view you might care to put on the world, if that's more your bent. So, yeah, I think those strands get fed through because people are going back to old books and cannibalizing old books and cannibalizing old material and then kind of reinventing things. I mean, to go back to Harvey Day, he's interesting in that he includes sun salutations in one of his books, well before a lot of other a book from 53. Well before most other people were, before sun salutations became popular. They were imported into yoga from elsewhere. They don't have the same Western gym origin. They appear to have originated in India, although it's often hard to tell because a lot of exercise forms are hybrid. So if you're interested in vintage exercise, you'll know that what were called India clubs were very popular in Victorian times in North America and in the UK, and they're called India clubs because when the British occupied India and colonized it, they found Indian wrestlers practicing with these exercise implements. But in actual fact, they appear to have originated with Persian wrestlers. I mean, obviously, Persia is not so far from India, but it is a different culture. But you've always got this crossing and blending. But the Indian clubs are called Indian clubs because that's where the British encountered them, not because that's where they originated. Um, so yeah, you can just have a whole lot of different things going off, I suppose, and different traditions. But things gradually change, and the elements aren't so necessarily easily identifiable as people kind of rewrite them and rework them. But again, once you got to the pandemic, you saw a lot of this kind of discourse re-emerging.
Mm.
The whole, when I was going to yoga classes, which I stopped before the pandemic, you'd hear a lot of anti-vax talk, but it would be anti-MMR, and we've
Mhm.
seen where that's taken us in terms of measles and stuff like that. So the anti-COVID vaccination ideology that developed around parts of the wellness industry, parts of the yoga world aren't that surprising. And, when you look back to the kind of roots and origins of modern postural practice, it's probably not surprising that you'd end up with all these right wing positions and this embracing by certain elements within the yoga world of QAnon ideology.
Mm.
Um, there's clear parallels between the different periods, even if it's not always easy to trace the exact lines of transmission of things or to know whether things have reappeared because there's a certain mythic structure around practices and beliefs, or whether there is a direct transmission. So, wouldn't make any claims about what I can see is, for example, there's a relationship between esoteric Hitlerism and QAnon theory in terms of the supernatural being who's going to save the world, which is in one Hitler, in the other Trump. Whether the people who invented QAnon, which is, we have some good ideas about where it came from, but we can't necessarily 100% prove who was behind originated QAnon, whether there's a direct transmission of esoteric Hitlerism into that, or whether it's just because they're using a kind of similar worldview and mythic structures that you have the same story appearing. I mean, there's more work required to figure that out, and sometimes you simply can't figure things out. I don't, you know, I don't think we fully figured out exactly necessarily where Pierre Bernard got his practice from, but there's enough indications to suspect that he may have created what he did himself. But then was the a direct transmission from him to India, or did what arose as modern postural practice in India arise separately because people were taking the same elements and putting them together?
Mm. Yeah, it's I mean, you sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, but do you see that there is like a sort of direct line from the kind of mid-century kind of yoga practitioners, or yoga kind of celebrities, I suppose you'd call it, to the kind of modern day wellness influencers and like self-help entrepreneurs and all this kind of thing? Do you feel that there is a direct line there?
I think in terms of a lot of the occult belief, there's definitely a direct line, and you know, but I think things get mutated through going through different sources. They're not necessarily going back to the original source. I don't think many people now would necessarily, you. I'd go to a yoga class and you'd hear a yoga teacher talking about chakras, but I very much often quite inaccurately, if you knew anything about occult theories of chakras, of which I wasn't necessarily the biggest expert in the class. There might be someone near me who'd come up to me afterwards because they saw me kind of grimacing when the teacher was talking about chakras, but they'd be a true believer in chakras and tell me that the teacher had got it all wrong, and this chakra was this color and that chakra was that color. In terms of the teacher, I think they probably picked it up from someone else in the yoga world. But I think if so there's a lot of loose talk that distorts things. But there are key texts like the Serpent Power, and I do think that's still having an influence on descriptions of tantra and other matters now. So I think there is a transmission, but I think a lot of people are not, going back to those earlier sources to plunder them. They're kind of hearing rumors of those earlier sources from other people.
It's a bit like the with the QAnon stuff. The Kali Yuga was a big deal within that kind of narrative, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that's another thing where, again, it's kind of, it makes you wonder where they got that from. Where did that kind of where within that stew of people did they find the Kali Yuga? It's kind of
Well, one
interesting.
would guess it's probably Julius Evola.
Yeah, probably.
Probably, but,
Yeah.
probably distorted through 100 other things.
Yeah. So a lot of people would probably read your book and say, "Well, I'm just doing yoga because I've got a bad back," or I've. What's your kind of response to the people that are claim to be into it just for health, purposes because they want to fix their back or?
Well, I would have thought there were probably, better exercise systems for them, because in terms of, yoga, there's a lot of backbending, and,
Mm.
yoga isn't the only, thing you could, you know, possibly damage your back with. I mean, obviously, contortion is an even more extreme version of that. And I wouldn't stop people doing contortion, or modern postural practice, but they should be aware of the kind of health risks of some of the practices. So, for example, modern Pilates, as opposed to the original 34 Joseph Pilates exercises from the 30s, where there's more emphasis on the scapulas and the fact that our upper backs are quite weakened from spending a lot of time in front of computer screens, just as I am now, or driving if you happen to have a car, which I don't. Um, Though you'd need a change within the exercises. So just like yoga, there's all sorts of styles, there's all sorts of types of Pilates. But I would say and Pilates has just become more fashionable, particularly the reformer, because it's so extortionately expensive to do. So obviously that's appealing to rich people to make themselves look superior.
I,
But
I do the reformer, the new version of it called the new former, because
oh
and
right.
I don't pay separately for it. It's just, it happens to be in my gym, and it's one of those ones where it has like a screen and it teaches you what to do. And but even in that, I noticed some. This is meant to be like very sciencey gym, and even in the sort of teachings on that, they start to mention things like energies, and you start to think, oh, here we go, here comes the here comes
Yeah,
the
no, that nonsense. I mean, there's all sorts of other things. I mean, I always think the reformer is kind of funny because if you think of a bull worker, uh, which was kind of big in the 70s when I was a kid, a lot 60s, a lot of adverts for it. A reformer kind of operates on the same spring principle, although obviously, a bull worker is a very cut down version of that. Using isometrics rather than isotonic in the
Mm.
original version. But I noticed the new ball worker instruction actually include isotonic as well as isometric exercises. We'll leave that one for now, but muscle fans will know what I'm talking about. But yeah, no, I would say there are better exercises they could do and safer exercises. I mean, again, it depends on exactly what they're doing as yoga. And there's a lot of other things that can be criticized for the same things. I mean, in terms of martial arts, a lot of right wing connections, most obviously with some of the Japanese ones, like Yoshiba, the founder of Aikido, had a lot of very right wing connections. And then Shorinji Kempo, which is a really interesting story in itself. So the founder was a spy in Manchuria for the Japanese and went to the Shaolin Temple and claimed to have kind of deciphered the murals or whatever were on the wall. So went back to Japan later and taught what he claims is original Shaolin Kung Fu under the Japanese name Shorinji Kempo. Again, that has enormous connections to the far right in Japan, and people will be familiar with some of that through writers like Mishima, probably. Um, so it's not unique to yoga to have this level of bullshit, but I think it's just absolutely saturated with health misinformation. I mean, I mentioned the claim in the book that a shoulder stand can cure leprosy. I mean, it's just utter nonsense, and people need to go in knowing that they're probably going to hear a whole lot of horse shit in terms of what's going to be done for them. And if that's what they want to do, that's what they want to do. Fine, I'm not going to stop them. But why not just go and get an original Ling gymnastics manual, and you can do a lot of the same exercises without any of the kind of new age gloss, basically.
So if we
Um,
if we strip away the kind of fascist and kind of grifter elements that and histories, what's kind of left of yoga? You know, what's left of it for kind of contemporary practitioners? Like, where should they look?
well, it depends what they're interested in, because I went to yoga classes to learn to stand on my head, and I was interested in exercise. In different exercise systems, and I quite like to try out different things. But in terms of, if you're interested in exercise, you can find all the exercises in other systems. They're not really unique to yoga, but you might decide that you want some and not others. I mean, I also think in terms of the lower body, if people are getting older, and obviously falls is a concern with older people. I mean, Tai Chi is training the legs much more, so it's more efficient. But actually, why not just go and do some really heavy squats and deadlifts if you want to train your legs? Um, but the other side of it, which doesn't interest me whatsoever, and that wasn't included in the gym yoga classes I mostly went to, is meditation. But that's not my interest. I mean, you might have more knowledge of that and advice on where people might go for meditation. I mean, for me, if I'm lifting weights, I can get in the zone, so I'm quite happy. I don't need any kind of guided meditation or something.
Mm. Yeah, I've just started
Um,
lifting weights. It's like properly. I'm doing it, 6 days a week at the moment, which is probably too much, but it's
I
kind
hope
of
you're
addictive.
Yeah, I hope you're doing splits then.
Yeah, oh
Part
yeah, yeah,
different
yeah, yeah,
different body parts, different days.
breaking up the body parts over different days and all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah, no, I only do, weightlifting 3 days a week, but, I'm modest like that. Makes me feel superior.
So I guess final question really is, how do you want readers and the kind of listeners of this show to kind of come away thinking about yoga really? Like what's, after engaging with your book and obviously this interview, like what would your kind of take home message be, I suppose?
Well, I think it's, don't believe the bullshit, and if you enjoy it, you enjoy it. I can't stop you doing it, you know what I mean? But do
Mm,
think about the health risks of back bends and some of the other exercises. I mean, I've seen, some of the people who were teaching me yoga. I think I started in 2009. I mean, they've actually absolutely wrecked their bodies,
mm,
um, from kind of pushing themselves in absurd ways. I mean, of course, you can do that with other exercise, but I've certainly noticed it more with yoga than anything else. Um, but yeah, if someone really wants to do something that has a potentially quite negative effect on their health, who am I to tell them that they can't do it? But they should go in with their eyes open. I mean, obviously, not all yoga practice is going to do that. If you're going to yin yoga classes, I don't think it's actually, you might be doing the odd back bend, but you're going to be doing stretches that aren't going to actually impact you. I mean, I've tried all sorts of styles. I actually like Astanga, which is, of course, the one everyone says, or like, is more likely to lead to injury than anything else. But, hey, I like athletic kind of things. And interestingly, it was also the class that had the majority of younger men in, who weren't to be found in hardly any of the other classes or any of them at my gym. But yeah, I'd just like people to go away and kind of think, not, no, this isn't a 5,000-year-old tradition. This is something that was invented, maybe 120 years ago. And, you know, not to believe the occult saturated health misinformation that accompanies it, because it really bothers me that people kids should be dying from measles, for example, and that people should
mm,
be running campaigns against vaccination, which is actually it isn't just your individual choice not to have a vaccination. It impacts on the whole of society, when a whole group of people decide not to have a vaccination. So
mm,
I'd really like people to yeah, there's a difference, I guess, between alternative medicine and complementary medicine. Alternative implies a rejection of modern scientific medicine, which I think is quite backward. I mean, science isn't perfect. One can make critiques of science, but actually, it's the best that we've got at the moment in terms of medical care. Um, and also, I think people need to get away from the idea that it's an individual choice to be healthy or not. In that, while you can do certain things, if you haven't got clean water, for example, then you're going to find it very hard to be healthy. So there are, think of the whole society and don't believe this wellness bullshit. I also, you know, I mention it in the book. I mean, from James Lee Richardson through to Alex Jones of Infowars. James Lee Richardson running the mail order yoga courses in the early 50s. They were selling health supplements. Supplement business makes a hell of a lot of money, and people should just be eating proper food. I just like to see a lot of this very scammy marketing of products and services more questioned, I guess. And
BCAAs, that was a recent one, wasn't it? The branch chain amino acid drinks that
oh god, yeah, yeah.
apparently were tested and proven to be utter nonsense, but you still see them popping up in modern kind of wellness products and stuff and supplements. It's no, it's you've got to be. It's like a minefield, isn't it? Especially in the supplement sort of business. I sort of fell for it for a while, and then actually started to look into the kind of science of a lot of it, and just thought, actually, a lot of this is crap that I'm putting in my body. It doesn't. It's just like snake oil, basically, the kind of modern version. But
Yeah,
yeah,
and in actual fact, there's stuff now about people, taking too much of certain vitamins and damaging their health basically through excess. And what a lot of people will tell you as well, it may not work, but it's not going to do me any harm. And it's like, well, it's certainly not doing any harm to the company selling you the
no.
product. It's not, someone's making a lot of money, but actually, it might do you harm. Yeah, so I just like a more critical attitude. And I'm not a huge fan of religion myself, but if people want a religion, maybe they should go to the mosque or go to church or whatever it is that or or embrace a kind of recently invented religion like Wicca, for example. Which I don't think anyone who's done much reading can think that that isn't a recent tradition.
Mm.
So yeah, but I'm fine without it. I just like to lift my weights, do my squats.
So, final thing, what do you have coming up next? I know you've only just put this book out, so what's next on the release schedule?
Well, the next book is actually going to be in a little American publisher called PM Press. They asked me to be in their outspoken writers series. So we've just been finishing that off. So it's some old stuff. I mean, it goes from the writing in the book goes from 1986 to last year, 2024. So there's some unpublished material, there's some old material kind of representing what I did as a fiction writer. And there's an interview, there's one piece of non-fiction about public art in the City of London, which is unpublished, but based on a panel talk I did for Art Review last year. And I think there's another piece from last year that's unpublished, or no, was first published last year anyway. So that's a kind of survey of me more as a. There's a whole lot of people in it. I mean, from people I know like Michael Moorcock to people I don't know like Ursula Le Guin. It's a very interesting series. So I'm pleased to be in that. I have a novel written in first draft, but I probably want to get another non-fiction book done. But there's so many areas in which I might go. I mean, obviously, from kind of yoga, you could go to Tai Chi, although I'm probably more interested in a broader martial arts thing. But I'm also very fascinated by the influence of religion on exercise. So you can go back to the 19th century and see things like muscular Christianity. And how that kind of impacts people kind of mixing religion and exercise in a different way. And also, what I didn't cover in the book were figures like J.M. Duchenne, who is the most famous of the Christian yoga practitioners, which was a kind of particularly big in the 70s. His most famous book actually being called Christian Yoga, although he did do other books on yoga apart from that, and there are other writers. So there's a whole lot of things there, but I'm also very interested in kind of coming from Bourdieu, the notion of the field of sport, and what fits kind of in the centre and what's more on the periphery. And it's definitely what's more on the periphery that interests me from kind of wrestling, because it's not obviously in the Olympic style wrestling, but in terms of most of the wrestling that people watch and the kind of wrestling I watched as a kid when it was Mick McMahon and Big Daddy. Um, fixed matches, so it's a kind of entertainment, and you can think of martial arts films very much in that way. Bodybuilding, again, is very much on the edge of the field of sport. So I'm interested in all those things, but I'm also very interested in the relationship between kind of enduring pain in purposive, exercise, and in sport and BDSM. So there's a whole, raft of things I could be writing about. But
Yeah, it's
this week I seem to have an interview every day. I mean, it's gone absolutely crazy. I've
mm.
got, El Mundo and El País, the two Spanish newspapers of record, interviewing me this week, and Die Welt, which is one of the German newspapers of record, ran a feature on the book. I think last week they basically summarised the first 2/3 of the book, which was about to influence them, and at the end said, "Oh yeah, this is from the book by Stewart Home." Yeah, thanks a lot. You could have rung me up and paid me to write an article.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that I shouldn't be claiming that's keeping me busy, because they did the work for me, but kind of drew extensively on my writing. But yeah, there's just a lot of stuff going on with this, and I'm doing a lot of interviews, and obviously focusing on my social media as one has to these days.
Yeah, yeah, it seems to
More
be the
than
way
I'd
now,
like
doesn't it?
to. I
Yeah.
like to go on once a day and then go away for a couple of weeks and ignore it. But I don't
Yeah.
think Pluto would be entirely happy with me if I did that. And they are a very nice indie leftist publisher. They're fantastic. I mean, they've done a really good job with the book, and I'm very happy with them.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you giving us some of your time. It's a great book, and I encourage everyone to pick it up and read it and internalize some of the the
Some of
stuff
the
that you
lessons.
uncovered. Yeah, yeah.